Our text this morning is from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 22. And if you're using the Bibles provided, it's on page 957. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were well under a cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. The rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down and to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of age has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide a way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you for reading that, Wendy. Let me encourage you to have a copy of God's Word open to that text. If you're using one of the Bibles provided for you there, as was mentioned, this is page 957 as we continue on. Thank you, music team, for your ministry to us and leading us. I'm so thankful for that. I noticed Megan's violin has 3 strings on it today, so apparently Megan doesn't need 4. She's just 3. No, one broke this morning, and she troopered on and still doing it. So thank you. I know that these things are unsettling to musicians, so thank you for doing that. I truly mean that. Thank you. Grateful for our teams that work so hard together here. Well, if you know me at all, you know that I have an appreciation for history. I love the fact that the Lord has asked me and given me the privilege to serve in a church that, by American standards, is fairly old. We started in 1855 here, and so that's a privilege for me to be part of that legacy. A couple of years or so ago, I had the privilege of going to the UK and did some study at the John Rylands Library in Manchester. The thing about the John Rylands Library there is that they have lots and lots of manuscripts that you can look at. It's an impressive place to be and to study. So if you like to study, if you like libraries, your heart's beating a little faster right now. I mean, these are just great places to be in and study. They have just old books. This is like a 1519 copy of the Magna Carta that they have there in the library, and I wasn't able to handle it. They didn't trust me, but I was able to look at it, and it was neat. But I was able to go through lots of manuscripts and letters and things like that. I don't know if you recognize that signature. That's William Wilberforce. I held his letter that he wrote. But I didn't go there to study Wilberforce. I actually went to study Wesley's writings. John and Charles Wesley. Jason mentioned Charles Wesley in Adult Discipleship Hour, and he's credited with around, I mean, he probably could have done better if he'd have focused, but he's credited with about 6,000 songs that he wrote. I don't know how. I have no idea how he was able to do that. But I went through a lot of his writings, and thankfully a lot of it is cataloged, so you can kind of know what's in each letter ahead of time. And so I had to set this up ahead of time, and for some of the studies that I was doing, they pulled some of these out for me. And so, right here, this red mark, I didn't write that, by the way. This is digitally put on there. I didn't go in with a red pen, and do that. He basically says there, you can't read it, I know, from where you're sitting, but he says the absurdity of a weekly offertory without a weekly communion. He's talking about how that we need to have the table every Sunday. In the previous page, I didn't put the picture up for you to see, but the previous page says that communion ought to be every Lord's Day. And so I was studying different things, and so I was able to take these different pictures, and it was just a wonderful experience. Now, why am I sharing this with you? Well, because one of the reasons why I appreciate history so much is this quote right here. Those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it. How many of you have heard that before? Okay, I knew you. Who said that? Does anyone know? Okay, all right, that's a theory. Okay, so Winston Churchill is credited with it, or George Hegel, which is a German philosopher, or Santayana, the Spanish-American poet, is also credited with it. So who do we give credit to? Well, I'm not much of a poet. Santayana's out. And so, since the other guy was German and, he was, England was part of the Allies and won the war, we'll give it to Churchill. Okay, so Churchill said this. But those who did not learn from history are destined to repeat it. We have to be people who learn from the past. That's what Paul is doing in this text here. In this text that Wendy just read for us here, brings up this idea of history and what had happened and why he brought it up. It's not just a history lesson, it's for the instruction. And so if I was to summarize kind of the point I'm trying to drive home today, it would be found in this quote here, that those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it. And so be warned, be instructed from that. Now, what does this mean? We're going to dive into that look, but before I do, let me just pause and pray and ask God's blessing. Father, it really is a privilege to stand here before my friends, my church family, and have this wonderful opportunity and this privilege that you've granted me to open the Word and to teach from it. God, I don't take that for granted, and I'm so thankful for it. And I pray that it would be helpful to the people who are gathered here or maybe listening online, that what we discuss now and what I teach, first and foremost, may it be accurate to the text. May it be true to your word. And so I need your Spirit to guide me in that. And may it be relevant and helpful to those who are listening here. Lord, we pray you free us from distraction. It's easy to get distracted. It's easy for us to have our minds wander. Lord, even me as a speaker, I fight that. And so, Lord, I pray, God, I pray that in this moment I'd be able to put aside anything that's kind of competing for thoughts right now. I'd be able to put that aside and focus on this text and what you have for us. And then those who are listening, remove distractions as well, we pray. And the goal is that you would be honored and that we would be built up and edified and become more like Christ. For it's in his name we do pray these things. Amen. So let's start with remembering the past, okay? We see this in verses 1 through 5. I won't go through and read all of this here, but really what Paul is leaning on is he's saying, I want you to know about our fathers. And what he's talking about the fathers there, he's talking about Israel's history, okay? The Jewish history, and specifically the Exodus. The Exodus is a pivotal moment in biblical theology. In fact, it can hardly be overestimated how significant the Exodus out of Egypt is to God revealing his plan for the ages even. If you were to look at the New Testament of how many times the New Testament writers reach back into the Old Testament, specifically in the Exodus of when Israel was coming out of Egypt, it's called the Exodus, you see how the emphasis is put on that. You know that this is a significant event, and it is one that is worthy of our attention. And this is why Paul keeps bringing it up here, and he brings it up here again. And what is the main point that he wants to bring up is this, is that everyone in the Exodus had God's blessings. He lists them there in the verses. He says, all were under the cloud. You remember the story as they were leaving out. They didn't know where to go. They were told to leave. They left in such a hurry that the bread did not have a chance to rise yet. And so they just grabbed that and ate this unleavened bread along the way. And that's what became the bread of the Passover when they celebrated this later on, because the bread had not risen yet. They left very quickly. And so they left out. But how did they know where to go? God led them through a cloud, through a pillar of fire by night. Whenever this cloud moved, whenever the pillar of fire moved, they knew that they needed to follow it. They had to have some type of leading. They were following their leader Moses, but Moses was following the cloud because he was following God, and that was symbolic of God's presence and God's leadership there. So all were under the cloud, not just some of them, all of them were, and that was a blessing to have this leadership, to have this something to follow. And it was God that had given that to them. It was a representation of God. It says all passed through the sea there. Paul talks about this here. He says all of them were in the cloud. They all passed through the sea. Of course, what story comes to your mind there? What is that? What is it? What is it? The Red Sea. Very good. So it's the crossing of the Red Sea. And so you remember they get there. Pharaoh changes his mind after releasing the Israelites. And so he chases them down. And they're at the Red Sea. Moses is saying, uh-oh, we've got a sea on this side, and we got the strongest army of the world at that time coming at me on this side. What do we do? God says, just walk through it. And he parts the Red Sea. They walk through on dry land. All of them were under the sea. The whole nation went through that. It wasn't something just the leaders experienced. It wasn't something just the elite experienced. It was everyone experienced that wonderful provision and miraculous provision by God. All were baptized into Moses, he says there. Now, what does that mean? Some commentators have gone really far in this, in suggesting that there actually was some sort of water rite that was done upon Moses' leadership and his inauguration of his leadership. We just really have no evidence of that at all. There's zero evidence of that. And I think that presses this too far. What Paul is leaning on here, he's leaning on what baptism represents. It's identification. It's immersion. It's this idea of completely following. And so just a few minutes ago, when Ariana was in the waters of baptism, she was saying, I want to completely follow Christ. I want to be immersed in Christ and follow him for my life. Whatever he says to do, that's what I want to do. And so I want to follow his leadership. That's what really Paul is leaning on here, for them to understand that their leader at the time was Moses. That was God's ordained leader for them to follow through the wilderness. They were baptized into Moses. They were given over to identifying with him and his leadership here. And then it says all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink there. God miraculously provided for them. And then even Christ is mentioned in this text. Here, Paul says that the pre-incarnate Christ was involved with the Exodus. So what this means by pre-incarnate Christ, this means that Jesus, before he came to be born of the Virgin Mary, Jesus existed. He's eternal. He's the eternal Son of the Father. So he didn't begin his existence on that first, what we call Christmas morning. No. He just brought on a body, a human body on that first Christmas morn, and he took that upon himself. But he existed before then, and Paul leans on this when he says this was Christ. The rock was Christ here, that Christ was involved with this. This is outside the scope of the sermon, but just for a side note, other texts of Scripture talk about how Christ was involved in creation and other events as well before he took on the body, a human body. So when Paul is saying here, he says they all drink of the same spiritual food and they drink of the same spiritual drink. And he says from that spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ, Christ was crucially involved in providing for them in the Exodus. Paul wants them to understand this, that everything that they were experiencing, all of them, they all were part of it. They had all part of those blessings that God was giving them in this Exodus out of Egypt here. But then he turns. When Paul he says they all have done this, and so what I did in my Bible, just because it helps me, I highlighted the word all every time in those verses. And then in verse 5, I highlighted this, but nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased. And Paul explains when he says, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. So while all were in the Exodus had God's blessing, most who started the Exodus did not make it out of the wilderness. They didn't make it out. A whole generation passed away because of the rejection, because of sin that we'll get into in a second here, that was a punishment. And so there had to be a new generation that rose up. You wonder why God had them wandering for so long? Do you ever wonder why that you read in the Pentateuch, and the Pentateuch is what some people would call the Torah, or the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament here, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those books. You ever wonder why there's like a giving of the law, and then you read later on, and there's another giving of the law? It's like, why we're reading through it linear, and we're saying, well, why is he repeating this? I'll tell you why, is because it's a new generation that has come up. And it has to be given again to the new generation. This is why that they wandered for 40 years. Time for a new generation to come up. Because most of the people who started the plan, or the Exodus, most of the people who took that first step out of the bondage of Egypt and started following that cloud, and the first ones, most of the people who ate those first spiritual food and spiritual drink that God was providing through physical means, they didn't make it out. In fact, the Bible talks about just a couple, actually. Moses himself didn't even enter the promised land, right? And so only Joshua and Caleb made it out. And so why is that? Why is Paul bringing this up? So this idea of remembering the past, this is what he wants to do right away. He says, I want you to remember this, but why? Why at this point in his letter of 1 Corinthians, what we call 1 Corinthians? Why is it that Paul brings up this historical lesson? I mean, it's nice for history, but what does it matter? And why did he bring it up here? And that's what we're going to talk about next here, is this idea of not just remembering, but learning from the past. This is verses 6 through 13. He says, now these things took place, I'm in verse 6 of chapter 10. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we may not desire evil as they did. Paul says, I'm not just filling time here. Paul didn't have a publisher for his letter that he needed to hit a certain word count for. This was something that he was very, very intentional at. And he said, the reason why I'm bringing this historical lesson up is so that you can learn from this. You see these examples, and that we may not have the same desires that they did. And so, the point that he's making here is that all sin starts with desire. All sin that we do begins with a desire in our heart. Every one of them. Every one. I mean, think through it in your mind. Play the tape in your mind, okay? There's a phrase that dates myself a little bit there, okay? Play the tape, play the digital file, whatever it is, okay? Play that in your mind, okay? What sin doesn't first start with desire? Now, some people say, well, there's things that I just don't want to do, but I end up doing it. Paul talked about that, right? Well, yeah, but there was a battle of desires there in that moment. So every sin starts with the desire at some point. And I'm really solid in that because James agrees with me. And if you can find an author in the Bible that agrees with you, you're in good standing. Okay, James chapter 1 says this, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed. How? By his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." So all sin starts with desire. So Paul's point, what he's getting at here, in the middle of this lecture that he's giving about, he started in chapter 8 about eating food that was offered to idols. In a private setting, he was saying, can you do this? Well, it depends, he says. And then he goes on about all of his rights, and he gives an example of the rights that he was setting aside, namely being paid for ministry. He says, I have this right, but I've set this aside because for the benefit of the gospel. And here he's saying, but what is your true desire? What is the desires of your heart? He's like, I want you to be reminded of people who were under God's blessing, people who had been given many things, but their desires showed that they were completely away from God. And so he says, this is the thing that I need you to think through. So all sin starts with desire. But more than that, all sin is idolatry. Okay, so verse 7, he goes right from this about this idea of that they had these desires, that they desired evil, and he doesn't want the Corinthians to have these same desires, and by inference doesn't want us. He says this in verse 7, do not be idolaters as some of them were. As is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And then he goes through some examples here. So I'm going to give those examples in a minute. But the point is this, is that he goes right from sinful desires to idolatry. Because all sin at its root is idolatry. We're placing something above God. If I sin, let's just say that I get angry at someone in an unrighteous way, because there is righteous anger, but let's say it's in an unrighteous anger. I am placing my desires, I am placing my wants, I am placing my sense of fairness above what God has clearly told me to do. Or if someone sins against me and I refuse to forgive them, just absolutely refuse to forgive them. This is idolatry, I'm placing my sense of justice and my sense of what I deserve above what God has clearly told me to do, is that I need to have a forgiving spirit. Now, some of you might be running with this a little bit, and you're thinking of scenarios. Just because you forgive someone doesn't mean, and you can only forgive if there's true repentance, so we should put that in there. The person has repented. But then the other thing is that doesn't mean that the relationship is always the exact same afterwards. There's going to be consequences sometimes. But the point is that we should have a forgiving spirit. Okay, so every sin that we commit is idolatry. So he gives some examples here. He says, first of all, this unhealthy desire for sex. He says, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, if some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. There's actually a couple references. What Paul is doing here is he's just grabbing just illustrations, and he's actually kind of compiling them a little bit. And that phrase that they rose up to play really comes from Exodus 32 when they did the golden calf worship. Maybe you remember that story. Moses is up on the mountain, and he's taking a long time. People are getting restless down there. So what do? They take all the gold, they melt it down, and what do? They make this calf stuff, as in they worship, okay? So it becomes a representation of God to them, and they're worshiping this God, breaking the commandment of never to do that, and they were idolaters, okay? Interesting thing about that story is, where did they get the gold to do that? They got it from Egypt. Remember, God said that they would give things for the journey. And God had provided the Egyptians, provided the gold through the Egyptians, so that they would have sufficient means for the journey, the Exodus. And what did they do with it? They made a god out of it. Sounds similar to what we do. God gives us things for ministry. God gives us things to serve him. And what do? We make an idol out of it. Make a god out of it. God gives us a home to live in, and so we can have shelter. God gives us a home so that we can house people and we can show hospitality to other people. But what do? We make an idol out of it. God gives us a car so we can drive around from point A to point B. But what do? We make an idol out of it. God gives us children so that we can raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and we can produce more image bearers for God's glory. What do? We make idols out of them. Do you see the point? Nothing's changed here. And so the example that Paul's given here, he says that, listen, this comes from this idea of unhealthy desires, and then specifically here is this sexual activity, because when they rose up to play, it's a euphemism for sexual activity. And then Numbers 25 really captures this when they were worshiping Baal or Baal, depends on how you pronounce that. Of that they were worshiping him. That's the reference he talks about here when he says that in that day 23,000 fell in a single day. Now, if you were, as a side note here, because this may bug some of you, if you were to go to Numbers 25 and look up that text, you're going to see that they're going to say that 24,000 people died. You say, well, wait a minute here, Paul, he said 23,000 people died. What happened here? Why is there a difference? Well, we don't really 100% know, but here's probably what happened, is one rounded up and one rounded down. I mean, that's probably what happened, is one just rounded up a little bit, one rounded down. Or some other people think that because it talks about in a single day, that there was 23,000 people that died that day, and another 1,000 people died of complications in the next couple days after that, making it 24,000. Either way, the discrepancy doesn't change the point at all. But here, what Paul is saying is that these people had this unhealthy desire for sex, and that became an idol for them. And it caused them complete distraction away from following God, and they were disobedient. He gives another example in the text here, this example of unhealthy desire for control. When he talks about this, he says, at verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. What is he talking about there? Well, he's going back to Numbers chapter 21, and remember that was the text where the translations call it fiery serpents. Whether or not those were actual snakes that were on fire is doubtful in my mind. Probably what it was is that it was referring to the burning pain that their venomous bite caused, is probably what it was. But it's possible that these snakes were on fire as well. But I think it was more about the pain that they caused the people when they got bit. But what brought that scenario? They were saying things like, you brought us out here to die. And they were praying to God, and they were saying, you brought us out here to die. And then another thing is that, remember, do you remember how God provided food for them in the Exodus? Do you remember, what was it called? Manna, good, okay. So God provided this manna, and literally, the word means, what is it? And so God was providing this food for them so that they could have nourishment along the way. And he gave some rules about it, but basically gather it every day. Don't take more than what you need. Just eat it. God will provide. He was trying to get them to understand, you can depend on me. You can trust me. I will always provide for you. You don't have to be storing it all up. There was only one exception to the rule, and that was on Sabbath, getting ready for Sabbath. He says, I'm going to give you double portion before then, so you can take that so you don't have to gather and work on Sabbath. But then, every other day, just take enough what you need for one day. And so God provided this day after day after day. In Numbers chapter 21, do you know what they called that food? When they were angry with God, they called it worthless. And we have to eat this worthless food. This is idolatry for control. I want what I want. I want my leaders. How dare you think you know what's best for me here? It would have been better for us to stay in Egypt. I know what's better than you do. Now, we would never say that to God, or maybe we would. And maybe we do. We all want to be in control. And when certain life events happen that we don't agree with, we want to shake our fist at God and we say, God, why did you allow this to happen? Why is this happening? And let me tell you, my friends, there are so many times that I wish I had the answer for you. I'm confused too, a lot of times. Why certain people struggle with health things and why certain things happen. I don't always have those answers, and you've known me long enough to know that I don't pretend to know that, but I am confident, I will say this, I'm confident the fact that God is worthy to be trusted. And I would much rather have him in control and me in the dark than me knowing everything and in control. Because I'm not capable of it. I would mess things up. But we have this desire, though, to take over the wheel, so to speak. And they talked about this worthless food here. Compare that to how Paul was describing. This is their spiritual food, their spiritual drink. It was more than just food for their bellies. The normal means of provision are meant to nourish us physically and spiritually. So when we sit down to eat, we should worship. It's not just getting food in our belly. It should be a time of, thank you for the provision here. Thank you that you've given food that has taste to it. And you can actually enjoy it. When we lay down to rest, we should worship. Thank God that I can trust you, that I can go to sleep right now. I don't have to be in control. I don't have to keep all the plates spinning here. God, you've got this. I can go to sleep now. It's a worship time. When we have relational fulfillment through friends or even in a marriage or something, we should worship. Thank you that God uses other people to invest in us and to meet our needs. And so the normal means of provision are meant to nourish us spiritually as well as physically here. But there's a third example he gives, and this is the unrighteous desire to complain. He says, nor, verse 10, we must not, and then in verse 10, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. This is in Numbers 14, where the people rose up and they wanted different leaders because they were complaining against Moses, and they actually picked up stones and tried to stone him. There's been times where I've made leadership decisions that have not been popular with some individuals, but no one has ever picked up stones to stone me. And no one get any ideas, okay? But they were complaining fiercely against Moses. And God judged them for it. And so this not just control, but this idea of complaining all the time. Over and over again, you'll see this idea of complaint, that they were complaining in the wilderness. And this is idolatry. When we're complaining, we have a complaining spirit, it is idolatry. It's saying that we demand something different. And let me tell you, who here, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands here, okay? This is a rhetorical question. Who here does not struggle with complaining from time to time? This is one of the most easy things to do. And let me tell you, complaining is one of the most contagious things out there. It really is. There's sometimes, I've been in a situation where maybe I was like, oh, that was pretty good. And someone's like, man, that was terrible. Oh, yeah, you're right. That was terrible. Because you don't want to be the outside. You don't want to be the one that's like, well, no, complaining is absolutely contagious, and it is it's from an unrighteous desire here. But what does the text say? It says in verse 11, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction. This is a really key verse to understanding how the Bible is universal in its application. That while things were written as examples, it's for our instruction here. And so we need to study this. We need to remember, but we need to learn from this as well. So Paul leads us to understanding these things. But there's a third idea here. Not only is it that all sin starts with desire, or all sin is idolatry, he goes on in the text to show that all of us are susceptible to sin. In verse 11, I just read it for you. It says, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stand take heed lest he fall. So Paul is basically saying, listen, you're just as susceptible to what the Israelites did. So I want to remind you what they did so that you can learn from it, because you are just as susceptible to complaining, to sexual sin, to control, and a whole host of other things. Even though you're under the blessings of God, you're experiencing God's blessing, but don't be like the people who didn't make it out of the wilderness. So this is not just a history lesson. This is meant for our instruction. Now, interesting thing here, as a side note, this is a text where we could have gone a million different directions with, because there's so much here. But on the side note, I just have to make the side comment here. When it says in verse 11, I don't know if you picked up on it, it says, on whom the end of the ages has come. This helps us understand what people refer to as eschatology, or a study of last things, last times here. Basically, we need to understand we are in the last days. We are in the end times. You say, well, I thought that was to come. No, the Bible's pretty clear that we're already in them. We have a text right here, but also Acts chapter 2, verse 17 says, in the last days I will pour out my Spirit, and they will prophesy. And we see then later on in the chapter he did that. In Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 2, it says, in these last days God has spoken by his Son. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7, Peter says the end of all things is near. Like, it's here. Okay? 1 John chapter 2, verse 18, John the apostle says, brothers, it is the last hour. Okay, so all that to say, we say, what does that mean then? Well, we can make a lot of different teachings on that, but here's the main point we're going to make right now. Nothing else has to happen in order for Jesus to come back. In a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, he can come back and set all things right. And I want to live for that day. I want to live in anticipating that. And that's what Paul is leaning on and says, the end of the ages has come upon you. Jesus can come back at any moment. Be ready. Don't give in to this idolatry. You don't want to be worshiping these idols when Jesus comes back. Don't do that. And he says, and you're susceptible to it. All of us are. He says, the temptation, verse 13, is what's common to man. It's commonality. There's been times where maybe I'm in a counseling situation or something like that, and I'll say something to the effect of, well, I'm sure when he said that to you, you thought this or you felt this. And they'll look at me like, how did you know? We're like, who have you been talking to? Or sometimes I'll get a comment after a sermon, and they'll say something like, did someone talk to you about me? Because, it seemed really close to home here, And I can say in every one of those situations, I said, oh. But here's when someone, maybe in a one-on-one conversation, I'll say, you were probably thinking this way. And how did you know? And here's the answer. Because I'm a sinner too. And I know how I would feel in that situation. Because these temptations of sin is common to man. Okay? And let that be an encouragement to you, lest you think that you can't help another believer out with temptation or sin struggles. Okay? Don't think that you have to be always this perfectly trained professional to help another believer out. You have the Word, and you know that these things are common to man. Just share with them how the Word's helped you in your spiritual growth. And that's how God's designed it. Now, education and training is important, and it's good. I support it and encourage it. But don't feel like you don't have anything to offer people if you haven't gone through a specific course on something. You have the Word, and these things are common to man for a reason. Okay? So minister to one another. But he says, warning, this could be you too. And so I say this to us. I say this to me this morning. This idolatry could be us. And now the question is do we really truly believe that? I think academically a lot of times we do, but I'm not asking in this for saying, do you think that you will sin? I think you all would agree with that. Yeah, I'm going to sin at some point. Do you think you could? Is it possible for you to cheat on your spouse? Is that in the realm of possibility for you? Would it be possible for you to steal large amounts of money? Is that in the realm of possibility? What about abusing drugs and alcohol? No, I could never do that. What about, is it possible for you to take a life? Is that possible? You see, once you start thinking about these very specific things, well, I don't think I could ever do that. I would just say be careful, okay? I'm not going to say that I think every one of you is a potential murderer, okay? I don't look at you as that, and I don't look at anyone and say, oh, I bet they're cheating on their spouse. Nope, that's not my point by saying this. Here's my point, though, is that I submit that given the right circumstances, there is no sin that is outside of our capability because of our sinness, our sinfulness. And that's what Paul's point is. Like, take heed. If you think you stand, take heed, lest you fall. I'm not trying to scare anyone or shake anyone's faith because, I know with Christ, we lean on Christ. Absolutely. Of course, you have power over those temptations. That's the point of the text I'm going to get to in a minute. But before we get to that point, we have to realize that sin is so bad and we are so corrupted by sin that we really are capable of doing anything. And I remember, when I finally realized that about myself, I thought, I really, really am a sinner. And you think, boy, that's depressing. Thanks for the word of encouragement, Jeremy. Appreciate that. Well, no, but the message doesn't end there. But we have to sit here just for a second to see if we truly agree with that. Because if we do, then it's going to make the next point so much more helpful. But if we reject this premise, it's really not going to. The next point's not really going to be that special to us. So I submit that anything, and I believe this is what Paul's point is here, that anything that, given the right circumstances, we are capable of committing really any type of sin that's out there. And that's because at its root, all sin is idolatry, and we are master idol makers. That's the reason. But here's the good news. After sitting in that for a minute, here's the good news. All temptation to sin has an exit ramp. Okay, verse 13, it says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. All right? Okay? And he says, God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Now, the word escape there is incredibly close. In fact, Paul was definitely, almost certainly, making a play on words here. Because this word for escape is so close to the word exodus. Okay? He's going back to where the story, and he's saying, just as God provided a way for them to escape out of them, God provides a way for you to escape these temptations here. So how do we find this escape? What is it? Well, first of all, we have to lean into God's faithfulness. God is faithful. So when we feel this temptation to sin, we have to first see that as first and foremost, whatever it is, it's a sin against God. And God is faithful to us. Why would we sin against God? This is Joseph, right? When he was tempted to have the relationship, the inappropriate relationship with Potiphar's wife, what did he do? He says, how can I sin against God in this way? Because he knew God's faithfulness to him, and because God had proven his faithfulness through many trials and through many circumstances. And he says, I can't sin against God, because he was leaning into God's faithfulness. So there's the first thing. But we also have to understand that life is an endurance race, and it's not going to be easy, and so we have to withstand these things. But tangibly, what does this look like? So you live this next week, you go to work, whatever, you feel this temptation. I mean, tangibly, what can we do to help ensure that we don't fall into temptation? Well, there's a lot of different things, but that leads us to our final point that I'm going to move through pretty quickly here. Blazing a better future. blazing a better future. This is verses 14 through 22. And again, so much could be said in this section here. First of all, what I would say, though, is look at verse 14. Therefore, so now he's connecting it to what he just said about having this way of escape. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Okay? So the first thing we have to do is we have to be people who are running to obtain a prize. And I'm leaning into what he talked about at the end of chapter 9 when he says that we are to run, in verse 26, not aimlessly. And so he's bringing the same thought into this, where this idea of fleeing or running from idolatry. We have to run away. This was, again, Joseph. Remember that? Remember that scenario? The Potiphar's wife catches him by the garment, and he basically takes it off and runs away from her because he does not want to fall into that temptation to sin against his God. And so he's fleeing from idolatry. So tangibly, if you know that there are things that are temptations for you, run away from them. Okay? So if you know that alcohol abuse is a struggle for you, don't go to a place that sells alcohol by yourself where you will be tempted to buy alcohol. Okay? So you're running away from that. Okay? If there's struggle with lust, okay, make sure you're running away from the areas of temptation that give you the easiest access to those things. Make some hard decisions in your life and say, okay, I'm not going to have unfiltered internet access. I'm not going to be unaccountable in how I use the internet, things like that. Okay, so we can go down the list, but I think you got enough there. So we're running away from something, okay? We're fleeing idolatry. But notice what he brings up out here, and he says this: I speak as sensible people, judge for yourselves what I say. He's like, this should make sense to you. He says, the cup of blessing that we bless is not our participation in the blood of Christ. The bread that we break is not our participation in the body of Christ. Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, and we all partake of the one bread. Then he goes back to Israel there. Why does he bring this up in this moment here? Because here's the reason. He's bringing up the Lord's Supper here. You realize that. He's bringing up this idea of communion or the Lord's Supper here. Why does he bring that up? Because just as it's important to run away from something, it's important to run to something. So when we're running away, we're always inherently running towards something. And Paul is saying, don't just be content with running away from something, run to something. And he uses the table as an example of what people have called the ordinary means of grace. Now, what is the ordinary means of grace? The ordinary means of grace are these conduits that God has given to us that provide spiritual nourishment and growth for us. It's the way that God helps us grow. These are not things that provide salvation. Okay, I want to be very clear on that. When I say the ordinary means of grace, I'm not talking about bringing salvation. So at the table here, we don't get salvation at the table, or any of the other ordinary means of grace. We don't find salvation there, but we find nourishment there. We find equipment. So we're running away from sin, and we're running towards these ordinary means of grace, and Paul brings up the Lord's Supper here. What would be some other ordinary means of grace? Prayer, Christian fellowship, Bible, of course, things that God has clearly designed that would be for our growth and for our spiritual nourishment. And here, Paul brings up the table here. And he says that there's many Corinthians, yet one body. He says that we need to be unified in this. There's this idea of participation in fellowship, this idea of identification. This is what Ariana did in the waters of baptism. We talked about baptism earlier in this text. And now he's bringing it into the Lord's Supper, where this is a renewal of that. And so where we renew our identification with Christ. And so we run to obtain the prize. I apologize, I forgot to click. Example is that he says, run to the table. Now, the table is the ordinary means of grace that God has given to us so to help us grow. And you say, well, why? I mean, it's just a little piece of bread. It's just a little cup of juice. What's the big deal with it? But it's far more than that. And it doesn't change into anything. I mean, it's always bread and it's always juice. It's the symbolism of it. It's what we're communicating when we do it. It's when you see everyone else coming up to the table that it's encouraging to you. it's a tangible way that God says he's forcing us to remember his sacrifice, remembering his faithfulness. He says, there's no temptation taken you with such as common to man. But God is faithful. He will provide a means of escape. What does the table do? It reminds us of God's faithfulness. It reminds us of Jesus who went to the cross and he sacrificed for us. So why do we run back to sin then? Why do we run back to what we want to do in this unhealthy desire for control or sexual immorality or this idea of complaining? What right do we have to complain when we come to the table and we see that Jesus has gave up everything for us? You see, this is why this is a means of grace for us, an ordinary means of grace to help us grow, is because we need to be reminded, because we forget so often that Israel forgot. And that's what Paul is saying. I want you to remember them so you can learn from them, so you can blaze a better future. And so you come to the table, you run to the table to be reminded, to renew, to reestablish, to reorient our lives around Christ. We do it with the Bible, we do it with Christian fellowship, and other things as well. And so the question is, I'm going to land it here, is this. You have a decision to make, and I have a decision to make. I'm not going to get into all the rest of this, maybe in a future sermon I will, but, he talks about this idea of participation with demons and all that. What was happening here is he's already dealt with the idea of eating food that was offered to idols in a private setting. That was chapter 8. Now what was happening is that Christians felt in their liberty they could go to the actual pagan rituals and participate in them because it really wasn't that big of a deal. And Paul says, no, that's a line you cannot cross. You cannot be part of the sacrifice system. You cannot be part of the ritual. You cannot be part. If later on the meat is sold at a discount and no one has a problem with it, fine, eat it. But to be in that situation, to take part in that ceremony, you are participating in this table of the demons. He says, don't do that. Don't you know that when you come to this is not just a passive thing. We're participating in something together here. So you can't participate in what God has condemned and think it's okay here. And so I guess the question is when he talks about the decision, are we going to follow ourselves? Are we going to follow sin? Or are we going to follow Christ? And here's the question that I just want you to think about for a second. How often do you think you need to make that decision? A lot of times we run into the error and think, well, that was a decision I made years ago that I was going to follow Christ. And that's important and that's good. I submit that it's a decision we need to make every day. And I don't mean that in a way of ensuring our salvation, but just reorganizing or reorienting our lives around him. And maybe that would be an idea of, I didn't truly believe back then or whatever. The point is that every day we've got to make this decision. This is why we need God's ordinary means of grace, because these are conduits that God has given to us for our growth and nourishment. But I have to say this. I'm looking at the clock and I apologize, but I have to say this because I can't leave it here. If I did, we could have some confusion. These ordinary means of grace, specifically the Lord's Supper here, this is not what has been taught. In the Latin phrase is ex opere operato. Maybe some of you will remember that. That means by the work worked. And what that means is that if I just eat the bread or if I just drink the juice, I get this nourishment immediately, regardless of any type of heart preparation. Paul doesn't teach that. We're going to get in chapter 11 where he's going to talk about we have to actually receive these in faith, okay? And so, ex opere operato, that Latin phrase by the work worked, just means, well, if you just do it, it's like a blessing you're going to get regardless of if you have faith or not. We actually have to receive this in faith. We have to receive this. This is, if you remember in the Reformation, 16th century Reformation, historians afterwards have kind of summarized their main teachings around 5 solas, if this means anything to you. And one of them is sola fide, which means only through faith alone. And that was written to combat this idea that these ordinary means of grace, just by themselves with no faith, will do a nourishing work. We have to approach the table in faith. We have to approach Christian fellowship in faith. We have to approach the Bible in faith, knowing that this is what God wants to use for our nourishment to combat, again, to help us combat temptation. Okay, there's so much that we talked about today, and there's so much more we could have talked about. But let me just land it with this. We had to learn from the past. Okay, we had to remember the past so we can learn from the past so that we can blaze a better future here. Because of this, those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it.